Well, hello, everyone. Good morning, and thank you very much for joining this press conference on the release of the U.S.-China Business Council's 2020 membership survey. By way of introduction, the U.S.-China Business Council has some 220 corporate members. Many of these companies are Fortune 500 firms, and most of them have significant investments in China. It's been said many times that the current U.S.-China relationship is at a nadir, the worst since 1989, or perhaps even since the reestablishment of diplomatic relations in 1979. And none of our members would dispute that very bleak characterization of the bilateral relationship today. Indeed, we deal with that reality daily. But still, we need to look forward and to plan the future of our companies, our workforces, the future of supply chains, of technology, in light of the tense bilateral relationship. And as we look to the future, it's helpful to closely examine data and to be as objective and as balanced as possible. So despite the poor bilateral relationship and despite COVID, the US-China trade and investment relationship remains very important for both countries. China remains our third largest export market, and approximately 1 million American citizens are employed due to exports to China. And if you include Americans working at Chinese companies in the United States and jobs created by US companies investing their profits from China operations at home here in the United States, the figure is even higher. To provide context for our survey data, let me note that US exports to China have been declining over the last 2 years. Between 2017 and 2019, US goods exports to China declined about 18%. And that decline has continued, but at a slower pace in 2020. US goods exports to China declined 4.6% in the first half of 2020 compared to the first half of 2019. As we all know, the Phase 1 deal between the United States and China is important, and the US-China Business Council and our members very enthusiastically support the deal. We recognize that the obligations taken on by the Chinese government to reform their regulations have been completed in full and on time. This is especially evident in the financial services industry, agriculture, and intellectual property rights intensive industries. And at the same time, when one looks at the export figures associated with the Phase 1 deal, one cannot help but be somewhat alarmed. In the first half of the year, US agriculture exports, according to US customs figures, completed only 19.4% for their targets for the year. So for the first half of the year, US agriculture exports were at 19.4% of their targeted number. In the case of manufacturing, manufacturing exports hit 28.6% of their target for the entire year. And energy, a poor 11% of their target in the first half of the year for the entire year. We do not yet have sufficient data to give you a comparator number in the case of services exports, but especially given the limitations imposed on travel and tourism, industry associated with COVID, we should anticipate that service exports from the United States to China were also extremely poor in the first half of 2020 compared to the targets for service exports from the United States to China for all of 2020. So we're very pleased, however, that both governments accept the challenges of meeting all phase one obligations, including the export targets. And indeed, we would very much like to support both of governments in this task. We feel that it's not too late, but robust action needs to be taken soon to fulfill all the commitments agreed to by President Trump and President Xi on January 15th in the agreement that went into effect on February 14th. We note with appreciation that USTR Ambassador Lighthizer and Vice Premier Liu He will soon be meeting to discuss the phase one agreement and talk about better, more robust implementation in the near term. We wish them well in this discussion, and indeed there is much work to do. So with this framework, let's move on to looking at other data. Please allow me to ask Jake Parker, U.S.-China Business Council Senior Vice President, to walk you through the major findings of our most recent annual survey of our members. And then we would be pleased to answer any of your questions on the record on any subject that you would wish. So with that, I will mute myself and turn it over to Jake. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Craig. And I think everyone can now see the slide deck that I have up on my screen. I'll walk you through today's presentation. But before I do that, I just wanted to note that the final version and authoritative version of our survey is on the website now and live. There's a minor change on page 10 that we made overnight. The percent change of firms decreasing wages, of laying off workers in the next year is 35%, not the 32% that was passed around in the embargoed version. That's the only change, just to make sure that you're aware. Now, before I get into the survey findings, I wanted to walk you through the respondent profile. The survey was conducted for 3 weeks in June. Around half of the U.S.-China Business Council's membership. In terms of respondent profile, the majority have operated in the China market for years, more than 2 decades. 53% of respondents were manufacturers. The reason that these numbers add up to more than 100%.
Jake, could you get on the phone? You're cutting in and out, and I think it would be good to start over again. I apologize for the interruption, but this is important, and we have to hear you.
Sure, absolutely. Just give me 1 second to call in.
Sorry for the interruption, everyone, but it's important that we be clear and concise.
Craig, am I coming across any more clearly now?
Yes, that's good. Please proceed.
Okay, great. Let's try that again. Apologies, everyone, for the challenges. That's sometimes an issue in these digital presentations. Okay, so first off, the final version of the survey is on our website. It's the authoritative version that we just published last night. There was one minor change between the final version and the version that we sent around an embargoed form, and that's on page 10. The percent change of firms decreasing wages, of laying off workers in the next year is 35%, not 32%. as was included in the embargoed version. Okay, so now before I get to the survey findings, I wanted to walk you through the respondent profile and some of the methodology of the survey. More than 100 companies responded to the survey, around half of the U.S.-China Business Council's membership. In terms of survey profiles, the majority operated in the China market for more than 2 decades. Around 53% of the respondents are manufacturers, 45% in services, and 20% in primary industries. The reason these numbers add up to more than 100% is some of our companies operate in multiple sectors. For example, they could be both an agricultural commodity trader under ag, as well as an oil process manufacturer as well, so multiple categories. Around a quarter of the respondents leverage China as an export platform. The remainder would be manufacturing in China primarily to access the local market. 2/3 of the respondents are based in China. 1/3 are based in the United States. Next, some of the key findings. Phase 1 is overwhelmingly supported by industry. Most see the agreement as the stabilizing linchpin of the bilateral relationship as other parts of the relationship deteriorate. The agreement has also stabilized tariffs and led to a robust tariff exclusion process in China, improving the short-term commercial outlook for companies. As a result, companies remain commercially successful. For most, revenue from China operations increased last year, and the overwhelming majority of companies operating there, 91%, were profitable. However, the deteriorating bilateral relationship has dented American company competitiveness. Remaining U.S. and Chinese retaliatory tariffs and export control policy changes are impacting relationships with Chinese customers who worry about price fluctuations and future access to American products. As a result, Chinese companies are beginning to diversify away from American products, and European, Japanese, and domestic Chinese companies are happy to take their market share. Still, despite these challenges, American companies are not reshoring supply chains. The majority of respondents didn't indicate plans to leave China, and only a small fraction of those that are planning to bring operations out of the China market are planning to bring those operations back to the United States. That being said, with a withering global economic situation and an increasingly tumultuous bilateral relationship, many American companies are pausing new investments and examining production concentration in the China market. As companies explore alternatives, it's increasingly critical for the Chinese government to level the playing field, because Chinese government policies and practices often offer competitive advantages to domestic companies, and it's critical to move forward with the economic reforms to entice foreign companies to continue their commitment to the China market. If I could leave you with one key point from today's discussion, it would be that the deteriorating bilateral relationship is having a real commercial and supply chain impact on American company operations, along with a domestic policy environment in China that's tilted toward increasingly competitive Chinese companies. Optimism that U.S. companies can participate in China's future economic growth and development is moderating. All right, let's shift over to some of the detailed outcomes. First, on the Phase 1 agreement. This is normally not a part of the U.S.-China Business Council's annual survey. However, this year, days before the 6-month anniversary of its implementation, we're highlighting member company views on the Phase 1 agreement, particularly as rhetoric surrounding the agreement has been fraught in recent months. First, an overwhelming majority of American companies, 88%, are supportive of the Phase 1 agreement. Although China has taken steps to liberalize its financial services sector to foreign companies, reduce barriers to trade in the agriculture sector, and strengthen its domestic legal and enforcement regime for protecting intellectual property rights, the majority of companies support the agreement because it stabilizes a rapidly deteriorating bilateral relationship. However, a little more than half of companies report a neutral or negative view on Phase 1 implementation to date. So we have to make sure that we understand that difference. It's a general view on Phase 1, which is positive, and then the view on Phase 1 implementation, which is a bit more mixed and nuanced. And the reason that we think that the implementation side is a bit less certain is that the deal does not directly impact the respondents' business operations or it may be because many of those companies are still waiting to see if a commitment will be met that does impact their business operations. Several additional commercial challenges remain to be addressed in China, that is for sure. Ultimately, a diminishingly small percentage of industry affirmatively believe that the achievements of the Phase 1 agreement were worth the pain of the Section 301 tariffs. Now, shifting over to company performance, let's begin with a positive note. The overwhelming majority of U.S. companies, 91%, remained profitable in 2020. While that is down significantly from 2019, where 97% of companies were profitable, it's still remarkably high considering the pandemic and the challenging economic headwinds. Revenue margins are generally in the mid-single digits as opposed to the double-digit profitability that we've seen in the recent past, and the realities of rising costs and increased competition have increasingly led companies to treat China more like a mature market, and that manifests itself in a couple of ways. First, companies are no longer about expanding capacity in China at all cost, and they are, two, maintaining, automating, or reducing headcount, and three, they're carefully considering new investments and weighing alternative markets. On that point, let me briefly discuss how companies are considering their supply chains and future investments. Companies remain overwhelmingly committed to the China market, with 87% reporting no plan to shift production out of China. But the picture is more complicated when considering existing and future investments. A record high 24% of companies reported reducing or stopping planned investment in 2020. For new investment, the picture continues a long-term trend. Fewer companies are accelerating investments in China. As a result of COVID-19 and lingering tariffs, the majority are taking a wait-and-see approach and maintaining current investment levels. The trend of reduced investment is particularly apparent in research and development. In 2020, for those increasing investment in China, only 18% indicated that investment would go to research and development spending. This compares to 33% in 2019 and 47% in 2018. Part of this decrease might be a result of increasingly onerous data flow restrictions, the development of China's export control policies, and changes in U.S. tax policy incentivizing investment in the research and development area. The bottom line, companies are not divesting, but they are exploring alternatives to China for new investments. On the 5-year outlook, USCBC survey data have indicated that while the majority of companies are optimistic about their 5-year outlook in China, optimism has subtly moderated over the past several years, a trend that continued in 2020. While very few companies say they are pessimistic, only a fifth of companies are fully optimistic about their company's prospects in the market 5 years from now. However, decreasing optimism is neither inevitable nor unsolvable. USCBC has regularly called for China to speed up the implementation of its economic reforms and to fully implement its calls for improved IP protection, provide equal treatment for foreign companies, and allow the market to play a stronger role in the economy. The actions taken in financial services, agriculture, and IP protection in the last year as a result of the Phase 1 implementation should be a model for liberalization in other areas restricted to foreign investment. Urgent reforms are needed to the role of state-owned enterprises in China's economy, data flow policies, and China's industrial policies to ensure that business optimism is bolstered going forward. Now let's pivot to the top 10 challenges American companies are experiencing in the China market. I won't go through all of these, but I did want to highlight a few challenges and trends for our companies in the member survey. First, to get it out of the way, there's no doubt that COVID-19 impacted the metrics in this year's survey. The full extent of that impact will only become clear in time. Second, despite continued commercial gains in the last year, American companies are feeling a measurable impact from the deterioration of bilateral relations. While a degree of certainty returned on tariffs as a result of the Phase 1 agreement, many still remain in place, and expanding theaters of economic and strategic friction have amplified uncertainty for member companies. Third, I want to touch briefly on protectionism. We recognize that many Chinese companies excel at producing innovative, high-quality, and competitive goods. However, Chinese government policies and practices frequently offer competitive advantages to domestic Chinese companies not offered to foreign ones. Unfair competition is at the root of several of this year's top 10 challenges. Number 3 is competition with Chinese companies. Number 6 is licenses and approvals. 7, IPR protection, data flows, innovation policies, and investment restrictions on foreign companies. All relate to domestic protectionism. Protectionism manifests itself in 2 main ways. The first is in market access irritants. The second is in domestic company support. On market access irritants, these can run the gamut from the time and regulatory burden it takes for a company to receive a license or approval, challenges participating in standard setting and government procurement, to greater scrutiny for foreign companies on the ground in China. The other area is domestic company support. On the other side are policies or actions which make domestic Chinese companies, both private and state-owned, more financially competitive because of preferential tax policies, a lower cost of capital from preferential financing, and other financial subsidies. Next, the impact of the U.S.-China trade tensions on business. 86% of respondents report being impacted by U.S.-China tensions. The impact has been felt in a variety of ways. Lost sales because of doubts of continued supply, lost sales because of tariffs, and lost sales because U.S. companies are not viewed as reliable suppliers topped the list of reasons why U.S.-China trade tensions impact American company operations. This has led to an erosion of U.S. company market share, which has been absorbed by European, Japanese, and Chinese companies. Once lost, market share is very difficult to regain. Shifting to tech transfer, market access restrictions, joint venture requirements, or administrative licensing requirements such as those embedded in standards and industrial policies often preclude a company's ability to enter the China market. When asked to transfer technology as part of this process, companies are compelled to weigh the relative value of their technology versus the access to the China market. 13% of respondent companies in this year's report reported that they've been asked to transfer technology this year. That compares to 5% last year. On intellectual property rights, this was ranked as a top 10 challenge this year and regularly ranks in the top 10 challenges of our member company survey. More than 60% of companies noted improvement in IPR protection over the last decade. However, companies continue to express concerns with the IP enforcement environment. Though Phase 1 has set the stage to address IP concerns, key issues remain, such as IP leakage through administrative processes, weak deterrence, and high thresholds for burden of proof. For China, improved IP protection is not simply a matter of ensuring that the IP owners are compensated for their discoveries. It's also an economic issue. When American companies are limiting their operations in China because of the lack of full protection of IP rights, opportunities for job creation and innovation are lost, a trend that we see manifested in the anemic growth of new investment in research and development. Shifting over to data flows and cybersecurity. This affects almost all of our member companies, not just technology firms. The majority of our members, 84%, are concerned about Chinese policies on information flows and technology security. 71% cited U.S.-China political tensions as the top cyber-related concern. A recent outpouring of restrictive draft policies may exasperate these numbers. Other top concerns are more operational, such as cross-border data flows and data localization policies. A new data regime increases costs for businesses, for example, requiring them to build local data infrastructure, and at the same time decreases network security because companies are unable to use the best technologies or connect as seamlessly with global operations as they may like. And with that, we will pause and be happy to answer any questions that you might have. Thank you.
Terrific. We are pleased to take any questions about the survey or other subjects associated with U.S.-China relations and particularly the economic relations. I think that we presented a lot of interesting data and would love to have a conversation with you. So we'd welcome the first person to unmute themselves and ask any questions that you would like. or submit questions in the Q&A box. So, okay, we have a question. How do you think of the impacts of prohibiting WeChat and TikTok transactions on American companies in China? Are you lobbying DOC in this matter? Okay, well, let me take a whack at that. And I think that the first thing to say is that we support the administration's goal of protecting American citizens' data privacy and the national security of the United States. However, we are concerned that the scope of the executive order, let me speak about WeChat first. We're concerned that the scope of the executive order might be broader than intended. WeChat is an application that is really without any comparison in the United States. It's not something where we have a exact analog in the United States. And in fact, WeChat is a nexus point for everything from e-commerce and payments to communications and customer service. So just a couple of examples for communications. Many American companies rely on WeChat to engage with their customers in the China market. And it's important to talk with Chinese consumers. On the payment side, WeChat is extremely important. It's one of the two major payments applications, and if American companies were not allowed access to those payments, it would clearly have commercial implications. Many American companies are also active and successful on WeChat's mini programs. And this represents a rapidly growing segment for many American businesses. And in terms of applications, WeChat is the most widely downloaded mobile application in the China market, and removal from the App Store would limit Chinese customer base for American handset manufacturers, and indeed would help American competitors. I would also note that Tencent is an important company. Tencent, of course, being WeChat's parent company. It owns a stake in a number of prominent U.S. companies. It's a streaming, video streaming platform in China is very important for many American content providers. And restricting commercial engagement would negatively impact trade in the services area. And it would deprive Chinese customers or consumers of those services, and deprive American content creators and broadcasters access to a lot of revenue in the China market. Now, TikTok is a little bit different. Well, it's very different. Different company and different type of application. But again, we encourage the administration to appropriately calibrate the scope of this executive order. I think that there's a couple of concerns. If we single out individual companies, we should anticipate that other governments will do the same for American companies. We encourage the administration to use existing mechanisms, existing legal mechanisms, which we think are quite strong, and the criteria that the government uses to restrict foreign companies operating in the U.S. should be very clear. Obviously, if a foreign company has violated American law, they should be prosecuted through the courts, and punishments should fit the crimes. In this specific case, the U.S. government should share the evidence that it has upon which it based its decision to severely restrict these companies' business. Right now, that evidence has been presented in very vague terms without any level of granularity that would give one comfort that rule of law and due process has been fully given to foreign companies operating in the U.S. market. And rule of law and due process is very important. We demand rule of law and due process in the case of China. And we need to treat Chinese companies in the United States as we wish American companies in China to be treated. So that's a whole mouthful. Let me stop there. We have another question, a couple of other questions. Are you concerned the Trump administration may take action under 307 of the Tariff Act of 1930? Are companies reevaluating their supply chains in light of the crackdown on Uyghur forced labor abuses in China? Jake, do you want to take that?
Before we get to that one, I think Doug Palmer was actually next in the queue, and he is unmuted, so perhaps we can ask him to...
Forgive me, Doug. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to be rude.
No, that's okay. And I'm sorry that I was typing. I forgot that I unmuted myself. Yeah, well, I mean, that question in the queue is probably better than mine. I just wondered if you could talk a little bit about the meeting between Ambassador Lighthizer and the vice premier this weekend, in terms of like what is sort of like the best case outcome of that meeting. What are you hoping comes out?
Yeah, thank you, Doug. So I think that the meeting is scheduled at least tentatively for the 15th. And we hope that there will be a very thorough discussion of the phase one commitments, both on the process side and on the quantitative side. And I really emphasize that those are two different types of agreement. But both governments have expressed time after time their commitments to meeting both sides of the agreement, and we hope that that is the case. Further, we would hope that eyes are looking forward to phase two. We have encouraged the Chinese side any number of times to initiate an early harvest of some of the phase two agenda items. And there are many that are very much in the interest of the Chinese economic growth and Chinese consumers and Chinese companies. And that would be very true in the area of state-owned enterprises, subsidies, technology transfer, antitrust, and cyber. So we're hopeful that there is a review of the administrative and legal measures that the Chinese have taken, which, as I said earlier, we believe have been thorough and quite complete, if not fully in effect yet. On the quantitative side, as I said earlier, there's a lot of problems, and many of which are COVID or market related. But a commitment is a commitment, and we believe that the Chinese side can meet its commitments over time. And it is not too early to look at the phase 2. And again, it is in China's interest in terms of domestic economic growth to do so. And no need to wait for formal negotiations. We hope to see continued opening and reform in China, continued level playing field in a number of the areas that Jake has laid out. So I don't expect any major announcements after the discussions. These should be routine, but a continued commitment and hopefully movement forward on phase 2.
Great, thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you, Doug. And again, excuse me. Jake, do you want to take a look at Evan's question?
Yes, I'd be most pleased to, Craig. What I would say is that many of our member companies have read the ASPE report cited earlier this year and agree with many of its recommendations. For example, I know that our companies agree that any company credibly accused of forced labor in their supply chain should conduct immediate and thorough human rights due diligence. We also believe that companies encountering indicators of forced labor or other human rights violations should pursue the hard work of remediation and not seek a quick exit. I think going forward, what our members would like to see is the ability to ensure that they can audit fully their supply chains in the Xinjiang region. At the moment, it's extremely difficult to get people into that region because of some of the challenges domestically on the ground in China. As a result, we would encourage Congress, the administration, to work collaboratively with their counterparts in the Chinese government to ensure that access can be gained for those groups that are able to audit the supply chains of companies around the world going forward. Only through government-to-government engagement can these channels reopen to ensure that supply chains continue to be free of forced labor going forward. Thank you.
Okay, let's move on. A little bit of a different subject. It has been reported that 2 million American jobs depend on the bilateral relationship. Given the impact of the U.S. economy on these job numbers, why has there not been more emphasis on the ultimate cost of decoupling? I think that that's a great question. Let me spend a couple minutes on kind of the analytics here. The number that I have often used, and I'm pretty comfortable with, is that in 2017, there were about 2.4 million Americans engaged in U.S.-China trade and investment. Broken down, that would be about 1 million on the export side, about 1 million on the import side, and about 300 to 400,000 on the Chinese investment side. But it's very difficult to reach precise conclusions on the employment effects of U.S.-China trade and investment on a macro scale. And I've I've spent a lot of time trying to do this, and I've reached a couple of tentative conclusions. Firstly, in 2019 and 2018, when the Trump administration really rolled out its policies, the U.S. economy was very strong, and unemployment was very low. It's hard to remember that in December of last year, 9 months ago, unemployment was at 3.5%. And at that point, it was easy for American workers who lost a job in U.S.-China trade to move over to another job. And an example that might use is if a relatively smaller dairy farmer, 80 cows, had to sell his herd of cows to a larger dairy farmer, that dairy farmer was able to get another job in driving a truck or many other jobs available. And that's very different now in the current environment. So coming out with really precise numbers here is very difficult. Universities are going to be deeply affected by COVID and decoupling associated with that. But how do you quantify the employment effects from China on the academic sector? Very, very difficult to do. So I would say with some degree of confidence that at least 200, probably closer to 300,000 jobs have been lost as a result of decoupling. Probably more than that, but very difficult to quantify and difficult to prove, as many people have moved on to other jobs. But I think that the number in excess of 300,000 jobs have been lost is approximately right. But again, statistically, that is complicated and messy to prove. So let me stop there. And Jake, have you been looking at these incoming, and would you like to take one?
Sure, Craig. Maybe I can take the next one. The question is, could you elaborate on some of the obstacles with the Phase 1 deal's dispute resolution settlement system? Can companies report issues anonymously to avoid retaliation from the Chinese government? And what could USTR do to encourage the use of the mechanism? So though I didn't report on it in the survey results that I shared today, on page 4 of the member company survey, we do ask about the dispute resolution mechanism and companies' appetite for its utilization. And what we find is that companies are either very unlikely or unsure to use the dispute resolution mechanism. And the reason is that there are fears of retaliation domestically within China for doing so. I would note that the U.S. Trade Representative's office have been very willing to hear anonymously from U.S. American companies, both through the U.S.-China Business Council and other trade associations as well. So those issues can be raised in the bilateral dispute resolution mechanism process. I would note as well that at least based on our most recent understanding, no issues have been formally raised in that process because of a result of the Chinese largely faithfully implementing on their commitments in the Phase 1 agreement. So as issues come up, there are channels to get those concerns to the U.S. Trade Representative's office going forward. Thank you.
Okay, let me take Doug's question. Given your given your interest in Phase 2 deal, will you encourage Vice President Joe Biden to keep the 301 tariffs in place as negotiating leverage if he is elected president in November? The Vice President has already spoken on this, and he has suggested that he would not keep the tariffs in place. And I think that when you look at our membership survey, it's a relatively small number of our members who have thought that the deal was worth all of the pain that we have gone through. And you could refer to those numbers, but if I'm not mistaken, and Jake might correct me here, but it was 7% who thought that that this has been worth it, which is a drop from what it was before. So I think that the Vice President has already spoken on this issue. I think that he's got a pretty fine sense of what the costs have been on the manufacturing side of the tariffs, and on in terms of the retaliatory tariffs, how American farmers, ranchers, dairy workers have suffered. And so I think that the Vice President has spoken on this issue. and I'm not sure what I would recommend. I'd have to study it more deeply and have further discussions before answering, Doug, your question in a direct manner. But I think that the Vice President has already spoken on it. Jake, do you want to take the next one?
Sure, Craig. I'm going to take Andrea's last question. Has decoupling already begun? There's data showing that China is importing far less manufactured goods. Would this stabilize if the U.S.-China Phase 1 trade deal is implemented more substantively? On that, I would again refer to our survey data and then perhaps offer a little bit more, which is one, American companies are not in the process of divesting from the China market and moving back to the United States. There is some evaluation of their concentration of their production footprint in China, and they are seeking potentially new investments outside the China market going forward. That does not mean they're leaving China, just that investments that would have gone to China in the past are now more diffuse in the region or in Mexico or in Eastern Europe. What we hear consistently from our member companies on supply chains specifically is that they are manufacturing in the China market to access the Chinese consumer. And when they make investment decisions, they look at the whole picture, not just incentives. They also think about suppliers, customers, labor, regulatory, political stability, anti-corruption, and a compliance culture. And ultimately, success in China is important because it creates funds to enhance their business elsewhere. If you're not competitive in China, you can't be competitive globally. And that includes research and development spending. If U.S. companies were to leave the China market, Chinese suppliers may emerge that eventually become more globally competitive going forward. And if there exists widely commercially available alternatives, U.S. industry is at a disadvantage, and export controls don't help achieve some of our national security goals, which we've seen with some of the export control actions. So just in general, I would note that American companies remain committed to China, even if some of their future investments are beginning to shift outside of the market.
Okay, let me take Andrea's other question here. Specifically on the recent EO on drugs and medical equipment, what impact will that have on your members? Let me speak a little bit more generally, if I can. First, there is a great deal of interdependence, synergy, and a lot of exchange between the American medical device and pharmaceutical industry and China. American companies in those industries are very large in China and have a very well-established presence and are doing a lot of business. And again, I would repeat what Jake said. They are in China mostly for the China market. Albeit some for the rest of Asia and perhaps some exports elsewhere, including to the United States. In terms of supply chains, I think that COVID and other unexpected events like the Fukushima earthquake and tidal wave have exposed the danger of having a single point of failure within a supply chain. And all companies are wrestling with supply chain resilience and supply chain efficiency. And one needs both. You have a kind of a simplistic dialogue that companies need to have a more diverse supply chain and have other sources of supply outside of China for supply chain resilience. And I think that there is a point there. You want to avoid a single point of failure for sure, but that has to be balanced with supply chain efficiency. If you earn your supply chain resilience, but you're 10% more expensive than all your competitors, then it's not going to do you a lot of good. So you must be both efficient and resilient, and there is an economic trade-off between the two of those that all companies need to consider. So to Andrea's question, I think that as a general statement that we welcome incentives to invest in the United States and believe that such incentives are appropriate, particularly where there is a danger of a single point of failure. But we are much more skeptical about restrictions on trade that force companies to particularly abruptly shift their supply chains. This should be a more organic, longer-term process that takes into account both efficiency and resiliency. So let me stop there, and Jake, I would welcome if you took another one, and then I'll take another one, and then maybe we could close off.
Sure, that sounds good, Craig. So I'll answer Yudonghui's question. And the question is, from the survey, we can find that intellectual property, data, technology, investment restrictions, which are the hottest topics in the U.S. political rhetoric and media, are listed as the least important challenges in the top 10 challenges. Can we expect the trend of politicization of trade issues can be reversed after the election? I would just note that we're a nonpartisan organization, and we plan for any eventuality in the election. We will have a new administration after January, whether it's a second Trump administration or something else. And I think from our organization's perspective, it will be useful to use all the tools at the United States' disposal to ensure that the American business community can compete on a level playing field within the China market. That includes a diverse set of using multilateral institutions and reforming the World Trade Organization. It includes building multilateral coalitions with our allies to bring to bear some of the challenge, to work together collectively to address some of the challenges with China's state-owned enterprises, domestic subsidies, industrial policies, to try and move that needle together. And ultimately, there needs to be a bilateral component that includes a significant amount of negotiation between the two sides. We can't expect for China to resolve all of the issues in the bilateral relationship if we're not engaging, and if the only engagement channel is through the commercial track. So we hope that the next administration, whoever it is, will include a variety of those tools to ensure the American business community can compete as effectively as possible going forward.
Great, thank you. And I'll take the question. You ticked off an array of issues and problems affecting U.S. companies. How is the Chinese government responding to this welter of issues on a day-to-day basis? And I think that it's a complicated question, and there is no simple answer to that, given the size and the importance of the of the Chinese government within the Chinese economy. And I would say at a higher level that the Chinese government has shown has been very careful to react to American initiatives in a very calibrated manner. One example of that would be on, the visas for senior government officials, or there are a good number of examples of that. And the Chinese government at the senior level takes pains to express that they will support property rights of American companies in China and work with American companies to resolve operational issues. And we're grateful for that. We appreciate that. At the same time, the Chinese government has at many levers that it could use to level the playing field and to implement the phase 1 purchase agreements, which at least to date, it has chosen not to do. And there are 1,000 examples that I could give, but there are anti-dumping orders on American products. There are many tariffs that remain on American products associated with the 232 actions on steel and aluminum, which could be lifted. But the Chinese government is not doing those things, which it could do if it wished in a more earnest manner to meet the phase one quantitative obligations. There are many things that the Chinese government could do to increase U.S. imports into China if it wished to do so in accordance with market principles, but it hasn't done that yet, and I regret that. Also, I think that as our survey shows, Chinese government bureaucrats, and I would say it is equally true of state-owned enterprises, bureaucrats, are oftentimes very risk adverse. And I think it would be relatively unusual for a Chinese SOE or government bureaucrat to go out of their way right now to support an American bid or to encourage an American import, given the overall tenor of the relationship. Chinese government bureaucrats, SOE bureaucrats, purchasing managers would be concerned about being criticized, given the overall deterioration of the bilateral relationship. We have had American companies who have been told, don't bother to bid on this because you're not going to get it. And we regret that very much and hope that indeed the Chinese government does live up to its phase one commitments. And secondly, that there is an upturn and normalization of the overall bilateral relationship as quickly as possible. There's a lot of trade that can happen. There's a lot of jobs on both sides that could happen. We remain quite synergistic and interdependent. And we want to maximize advantages for American companies while welcoming Chinese companies in the United States in accordance to the rule of law that they also deserve. So with that, I don't know if any other questions have come in here, but Jake, any final words?
No, I guess the last thing I would say is just thank you all so much for joining us today. We always appreciate our interaction with the media. We're available at all times to speak with you. Our colleague, Doug Berry, who's on the call, manages our communications. Please feel free to reach out with him with any additional follow-up questions, and we can try to get those answered in due course.
Yeah, we are at your disposal every day and wish to have good, constructive relations with each of you. And we wish you well, and thank you for your attention today. And with that, it is 11 o'clock, so let us adjourn and have a great day. Thank you.